Have everybody's attention and just ask for those of you that don't have seats to please find your seats. We'd like to get today's program started. Most of you I addressed this morning at the York Fairgrounds, but I know we had a group from the Hanover-Gettysburg area that was led by Bob Miller and Pete Lehigh, and we'd just like to welcome you also. My name is John Bailey. I, along with my partner Rodney Seacrest, a U.S. Air Force Army veteran. Rodney, raise your hand. Own and operate Bailey Coach. And it's our pleasure to host our annual Veterans event to honor you folks for what you did for our freedom and also the freedom that my family enjoys on a daily basis. Gettysburg's near and dear to my heart due to the fact that my father was drafted at the age of 27 years old, and that was the maximum age then from what he told me, into the U.S. Army, because he was born in 1913. And I'm wearing today the patch insignia of the 9th Army that he served in Europe, and he went through five or six countries with General Simpson. And Dad, in his, I think, probably second day in the Army, and I actually wrote and got his Army records. In May of 1941, he was sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, and he told me that he did a forced march from Fort Meade, Maryland to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So I looked it up on Google Maps at 67 miles one way. That was his only basic training he had. Due to processing error, he never did any other basic training in the military. So I don't know if that was good or bad, but he ended up leading a mule on a mule train with a howitzer because he was going to go to Burma and Italy. Somehow he ended up as a sergeant in supply down in Texas, and he wrote a letter to his commanding officer, and I actually got a copy of that because I wrote for his military records, and he wrote in that letter that he had far greater talents to give to his country and that he wanted to go to OCS school. So he sent him to OCS school. He came out, and in 1944, March of 44, he was sent to Bristol, England. Now, my father was a licensed mortician before he went into the Army, and he ended up in mortuary services. And when they got to Bristol, England, he was in the 8th Army under General Simpson. Well, when they got there, they found out that there was already an 8th Army that was a British 8th Army, and guess who commanded that? General Montgomery. So why do you think we had to change it to the 9th? So those stinking Brits, okay? No offense to anybody from British. I'm from British heritage, so. So anyhow, Dad continued to serve his country through five different countries in Europe with General Simpson. He actually gave the order to found the American Cemetery in Margraten, Holland. I actually found a book, and you can look it up on the internet. It's called Crosses in the Wind. It was written by Schulman. And as we read through the book and looked, we found that Schulman's commanding officer was nobody but Captain Bailey. So anytime Schulman needed something, he had to go back to my father. So it was just kind of interesting the way the story was. And then my mother was a lieutenant in World War II in the medical corps. She was a dietitian. Dad was setting up a mortuary in her hospital, and they met, and Dad and his roommate went out on my mom and with mom and her roommate on a double date. And till the night was over, they didn't go out together. They switched. And the only reason the women went out with the men is my dad had access to the mortuary car, and everybody was walking after the war. There wasn't any gas. So I guess because of all of that, I stand before you today, okay? So just two other minor things about my father, really, I guess, kind of major. When General Patton was buried, he was buried amongst his men, and they had to move him because all the men were coming, and they were desecrating the graves around his gravesite. So my father was responsible for exhuming him, re-preparing his body, and then burying him where he is located today. And some of you have probably been to the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. Dad then also, when he was at the American Cemetery in Margarot, and he gave the order to start, Dad ordered for Memorial Day service that flowers be placed on every grave in the graveyard. And at that time, and it still was and still is today, it was the largest American and Allied cemetery in Europe with 17,000 American and Allied soldiers. And that's stated in this book that we found, Crosses in the Wind. So my dad ordered that flowers be placed on every single one of the 17,000 graves. So they went out over a 2-day period. He sent his funeral trucks out, and they got graves and they put on for the service. Final part of the story with my father is he was sent to Nuremberg as a witness to sit during the Nuremberg trials in courtroom 600. And when I walked in there a couple years ago, the hair did stand up on the back of my neck knowing that my father was there. And after they hung all the Nazis, they gave him to Captain Bailey, and he took them to Dachau, fired the furnaces and cremated them and disposed of their ashes in the Isar River. So he had quite a history, but like most veterans, really didn't want to talk about it because he told me war was too terrible to remember. So, you know, we're going to enjoy a great lunch. We're going to have some great programs. It gives me a great pleasure to bring up a gentleman that I've known for many years here in the Gettysburg area, and he's in charge of Destination Gettysburg. He brings a couple million tourists to town a year and makes sure they all have a great experience. He's also responsible for us being here today and a lot of the mechanics that are here. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Norris Flowers, president of Destination Gettysburg. Norris?
Thank you. And first, let me start by saying it is a great honor for me to be here to address you and welcome you to Gettysburg on behalf of the residents of Gettysburg and Adams County. As John said, we've known each other for a long time, and I'm not going to hold up lunch here long, but we're in Rotary together, and he's over in Hanover and York, and I'm here in Gettysburg. But at a Rotary meeting one time when he was talking about what you all have done the last couple of years, I said, I want you in Gettysburg. And I told John just a while ago, you have a standing order every year in Gettysburg. You're welcome every year here. But there's some people I want to thank. I want to thank John and the folks at Bailey Coach, but really the one at Bailey that really deserves the credit, she's not here today. She's back manning the fort, and that's Brenda Shue back home. And Brenda did a lot of work for Bailey, and thanks for Brenda. She was our point of contact. I want to thank the staff here at the Wyndham Hotel Gettysburg for their help. There was a large breakfast of high school students in here this morning. We had everybody from the sales manager to the janitors turning this room around for you this morning, so we appreciate that. We want to thank the licensed battlefield guides. They volunteered their time today to show you the battle, kind of a brief tour here in Gettysburg. We want to thank them. The Gettysburg Foundation that manages the visitor center at the National Park. And we certainly want to thank the Gettysburg National Military Park employees and the National Park staff. Utz for the snacks you had on the coach. The American Legion Guard from Biglerville that you're going to see here soon. A gentleman, I won't give this away, but we have a special guest for you after dinner. We have a great program from Tigrit talking about World War II here in Gettysburg. And there's some other folks that I want to thank that really did all the work today is the staff of Destination Gettysburg. They're over in the corner, some of them in their blue, if you all stand up. You know, the truth of the matter is it's great for John and I to come up with ideas, but it's other people that pull them off, okay? And so we appreciate that. A couple housekeeping notes. There are restrooms as you come out off to my right down the hall, and there's others off to my left. Feel free anytime during the program to help yourself. And with that, we will be dismissed. Your lunch is buffet out in the hallway, and the hotel staff will come and release you table by table. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wanda with the hotel. She's here somewhere to release the tables. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for what you've given to our country. God bless you.
back here. And these gentlemen are in their 90s. And one of the gentlemen came up to me and told me he served in the 9th Army, same army my father served in under General Simpson, and he was a tanker. So I guess we go from World War II, we go to the Korean War. If you were in the Korean War, please stand. Thank you. From there to the Vietnam War. Vietnam War, please stand. Thank you. And from there, we go to the Gulf conflict, to the Persian Gulf War. Any Persian Gulf vets with us? There we go, back here. Thank you. Okay, before I move on, did I miss anything? Good. Okay, to get our program started this afternoon, we're going to talk about World War II in Gettysburg. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tara Wenzel, who's going to talk to us about World War II in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So Tara, please come on up.
So maybe I can hide behind the podium this time, eh? Stand up, my husband says. Thank you. Gotta love them, right, ladies? At times. Well, let me tell you what an honor it is for me to be here with you all today. And I hope for those of you, I did get a chance to visit around to your tables before we started lunch. I appreciate you letting me kind of sidetrack you for just a little bit. But for those of you I didn't get a chance to talk to, it is truly an honor to be with you here today. And for you veterans, you know, when he was having everybody stand up, I was having a very hard time keeping it together. So I wish they'd have done that at the end and not at the beginning. But I am here today representing TGRET Corporation, and we're going to share with you, you took your battlefield tour this morning and saw the battlefield from a Civil War perspective. What we're now going to do is we're going to link that to World War I, to World War II, and even some post-World War information. So we're going to share with you some other things. And this is based on some information that we put together to support some World War II tours here in Gettysburg. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through, that this is an option that you can do. And we hope that you'll come back and see us from the World War II perspective. TGRET Corporation is a leadership training company, and so a lot of this information is in our leadership programs as well. So when you have people like a Winston Churchill, like a Dwight D. Eisenhower, like a Bernard Montgomery, like a George, like a Patton, these are people that are larger than life and people that have input to the way that history is changed. Believe it or not, what we find in a lot of companies today is that the problems that Eisenhower's and Churchill's and even Abraham Lincoln's ran into are the same problems that companies face today. We still have, and I'm sure you all in your family lives have this too, and I'm looking at my husband here, have difficult people in your families that you're dealing with. So it's not just from the business world, right? It's also from the family world. And so a lot of the same practices that these wonderful leaders that we have now come to admire, that they put into play to make themselves successful and to make their efforts successful, we can apply either in our business life or in our home life. So let's talk about World War II in Gettysburg. Okay, maybe. There we go. So these are the links that we are going to be covering today. Most of those are going to center around Dwight D. Eisenhower. He did move here to Gettysburg. The first couple of times he was here in Gettysburg, he wasn't particularly happy about being here in Gettysburg, which surprises me that he made Gettysburg his home post-military life and post-presidency. So the picture that you see here, this is one of the areas on our tours that we take folks past. This is Dwight D. Eisenhower's West Point photograph. This is at the Christ Lutheran Church just off the square in downtown Gettysburg. And if you pass by that church today, the 4 columns that you see in this picture, still unchanged from 1915. The metal Bible that you see down at the bottom, which is located at the bottom of the steps of the church, still there today. So you can go in and see that same church with that same setup as what they had in 1915. Now, the circle that you see there, that is Dwight D. Eisenhower in his graduating class. This class became quite famous, and it became quite famous for a couple of different reasons. Number one, there were 164 graduates in this class. Now, I'm not telling any tales to those of you that are in the military. You know that the military expects a certain number of us to wash out, right? Well, they didn't have anybody wash out of this class. They only had jobs for 106 Army individuals, but 164 graduated. So there were some guys that had to sit on the sidelines until they could get something in line for them. The other reason why this became known as a very famous class is because this became known as the class that the stars fell on. There were so many star generals that came out of this class. When we're going to focus on 4 of those famous star generals, we're going to focus on the 2 5-star generals and the 2 4-star generals. Now we know that one of those 5 stars is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower, our connection here for Gettysburg and World War II. Does anyone know who the other 5-star in this class was? Omar Bradley. Awesome. You guys are great. So those were our 2 5-stars. Now, to give you just a little bit of Omar Bradley's, some information about him, he got his 5th star in 1950 and was the last 5-star general to get a 5th star. So that's quite unique. He is in a very unique club, if you want to call it that. There aren't that many 5-stars. And Hap Arnold, surprisingly enough, was a 5-star general in not only the Air Force, but also in the Army as well. Because at the time he got his 5th star, there was no U.S. Air Force. It was part of the United States Army at the time. So he got once the Air Force was created, he got a 5th star for the Air Force as well. So also a very unique small club. I want to read you a small excerpt, and this is something that Omar Bradley ran into. On July the 25th, 1944, Omar Bradley was commanded to take the beachhead and move inland. And so he came up with a plan called Operation Cobra. Now, the idea with Operation Cobra, they put a lot of thought and a lot of planning into it, and they needed to get the Germans to move inland. So how are you going to do that? You're probably going to drop some munitions on them, right? Try to get them to move inland. But what happens when you drop a lot of large caliber munitions? You're going to cause a lot of damage. So what he came up with was the idea that let's drop smaller munitions. That way we won't create the rubble and then have to repair everything to get our tanks and our trucks and everything off. So that was a great plan. Now they set out 77 planes to do that. But unfortunately, those planes bombed short. They ended up bombing their own men. And at the time, there was a gentleman who was a 2-star general at the time. His name was General Leslie McNair. McNair was age 61 at the time that this occurred, so he was senior to Omar Bradley, but Omar Bradley was his commander. He graduated in the West Point class of 1904. And this is what Omar Bradley wrote about McNair's death as a result of that bombing. The ground belched, shook, and spewed dirt into the sky. Scores of our troops were hit, their bodies flung from the slit trenches. Doughboys were dazed and frightened. a bomb landed squarely on McNair in a slit trench and threw his body 60 feet, mangled it beyond all recognition except for the stars on his collar. It haunted them, as we still see with many today that return home from war. Very, very difficult. Our 2 4-stars, Joseph McInerney and James Van Fleet. Now, Van Fleet commanded the 8th Infantry and participated in the D-Day landings, and McInerney took over Ike's position as commanding general of U.S. forces of the occupation of Europe after Ike was recalled back to Washington, D.C. to become chief of the staff of the Army. Does anybody know where they ranked in their class? I mean, here are 4 individuals who achieved, some of the highest honors that the military has to give. And where did they fall in their class rankings? Does anybody know? You'd like to think that they're kind of up in the top, wouldn't you? So, let's take a look. So, Dwight D. Eisenhower was 61st in his class of 164. Omar Bradley was 44th in his class of 164. James Van Fleet was 92nd, and Joseph McInerney was 41st. Anybody know who number 1 in this class was? Does anybody recognize this guy? This gentleman's name is William E.R. Covell. Now, William E.R. Covell, he did achieve 2 stardom. He was the director of fuels and lubricants for the China, Burma, India theater. Number 1 in his class. How many of you have heard of him? I know all of you have, right? So, for any of you young folks that are in the room and your parents tried to force you into being number 1 in your class, just throw out the name, William E.R. Covell. West Pointers come back to Gettysburg even today. They learn military tactics here. So those West Pointers are still gaining the historical knowledge to be passed on from Gettysburg even today. So our next stop in Gettysburg is actually out where Pickett's charge took place. Now, something that you need to know. Although the National Park Service was created in 1916, Gettysburg Military Park was under the administration of the War Department until 1933. Now, they did work with the National Park Service. The National Park Service was working with getting the monuments out on the field. Even in the early 1900s, there were monuments that were started to be put on the field. But they did not have administration. The War Department did. So the War Department, probably not to the thrill of the National Park Service, decided to set up a training school on the grounds of Pickett's charge. And this was supposed to be a tank training school. So you can see why the Park Service probably would not be real thrilled. Why did they pick this spot? Well, they tell us because that spot, the topography of the land here in Gettysburg, and particularly that site at Pickett's Charge, is the same type of topography that they envisioned their tankers running into in Belgium and in France. So they felt that this would be good training for them. Now, I worked for the government for 37 years, so this does not surprise me in the least. The tank training school was established in 1917. However, it did not open until the spring of 1918, in April. This was supposed to be a summer camp. In a typical Pennsylvania spring, the guys moved up here, they're in tents, and we get 24 inches of snow. There is documentation of Eisenhower, a young captain at that point, running around between here and Chambersburg, trying to find as many wood stoves as he could find to keep his men warm. They had plenty of wood, as you can see in this photograph here. And the thing that's interesting, since you all were already out on the battlefield today, does anybody recognize that building there from your tour today? That was the Pennsylvania Monument. So that Pennsylvania Monument was there even in 1918. And there is a second monument located right here, right in the middle of the wood stack. They stacked the wood right up against it. Here again, I don't think the Park Service was amused. You can also see there are railroad tracks running through the area of Pickett's Charge. So there were a lot of things going on here back in 1918, and the Park Service probably wasn't happy with most of them. As a matter of fact, there is documentation that says it took several years for the scars, as they called it, to heal after the military left. Now, this was supposed to be a tank training camp. Guess how many tanks Eisenhower got in April when the camp opened? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir with you veterans, but what do young military guys like to do when they've got nothing to do? Yeah. So Eisenhower's men would come walking into town from camp. They'd hit up the Gettysburg Hotel and go to the bar and get in all sorts of trouble. Now, this was Eisenhower's first independent command. The picture that you see here is him with Colonel Wellborn. Colonel Wellborn was the head of tank training for the U.S. Army. But you know what? He had offices in Washington, D.C. Do you think he wanted to come out here to Little Gettysburg? He wanted to stay in D.C., so he was looking for that next promotion. So he turned over complete control to a young Captain Dwight D. Eisenhower. This was his first independent command, was out here in Gettysburg. And he wasn't particularly happy about it. There are letters that he wrote to Mamie complaining about being out here in Gettysburg. Why do you think he wasn't happy? I mean, it's kind of a nice spot to be. Why do you think he wasn't happy about being here? He wanted to go to war. That's what he signed up for. He had been in Texas, he had been in Kansas, he had been, all over, up and down the United States, but had not been to war yet. So he was not happy. Now, later on in that year, Spanish flu came to camp, as it did with much of the United States. So between September and October, he lost 122 men to Spanish flu. As a matter of fact, he ended up quarantining the camp and not allowing his guys to go into town because they were bringing back the Spanish flu. They had one doctor here at camp, and I don't know how effective that doctor was, because in the military's wisdom, that doctor was an OBGYN. Fortunately for that doctor, there was a very large Red Cross contingent here in town, and those wonderful Red Cross people came out here, and they set up shop out on the battlefield with his tank men and tried to nurse most of them back to health. At that time, it was a 4-hour drive by truck to get anyone to a major hospital. The closest major hospital was in Chambersburg. 2 men who got so sick they felt that they needed to get them to the hospital died on the way to the hospital. So that was not something that was really good. Before he came to Gettysburg, Ike was stationed at Camp Meade, which is now Fort Meade, Maryland. And he was next door neighbors to another famous gentleman by the last name of Patton. He and Patton were next door neighbors. And despite the fact that they weren't supposed to have alcohol on base, one of them liked to brew gin in their bathtub. The other one liked to brew beer in their bathtub. But during their time there, they both became enamored with tanks, and this is before he took over the tank training school. They would tear tanks apart, they'd put them back together again. He felt very strongly that we were not using tanks effectively in World War I, that we should be using them from an offensive, not a defense of the infantry. And he actually wrote a report to that effect. Fortunately or unfortunately, Patton helped him put the finishing touches on it because, Eisenhower, he was one of these straight shooters. It was bullet, 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 bullet. He was not flowery like a Winston Churchill would be. So to kind of soften it a little bit, Patton helped him put the report together because they knew it was going to be controversial. Patton didn't sign it. He let Eisenhower take full command of the report. And it did go up the chain. And the head of the infantry at Camp Meade got a copy of it. Do you think he was happy? No. He basically told Eisenhower he needed to mind his own business. So he kind of got reprimanded for that. Patton ended up doing his own report, and he softened the language a little bit. And he sent his report up the chain, figuring he might have a better shot. Yeah, he got reprimanded too. Now, when the guys were going out to the bar in downtown Gettysburg, what was Eisenhower going to do? Well, he ended up stationing 2 MPs on the front doorstep to try to keep his guys out of the bar. There was a standing law on the books that said any drinking establishment within 5 miles of a military installation had to be shut down. But this guy was still operating out of the Gettysburg Hotel. He was operating because he had a friend who was a senator. So he didn't have to shut down. When Eisenhower positioned his MPs on the front doorstep of the hotel, how do you think the owner took that? It was not good. It was not pretty. He contacted his senator friend who called Eisenhower on the carpet. The senator, when he talked to Eisenhower about it, Eisenhower, showing true leadership, even in his 20s, said to the senator, "Sir, I know you'll understand. My guys are underage. They cannot drink." What's the senator going to say? Now, technically, they could have shut the guy down. I mean, they could have run the hotel, they could have run the restaurant, but they could have shut down the bar. Eisenhower said, "I've already caused him enough aggravation. I don't want to do that. As long as he keeps my men out of the bar, he can stay open." Did that happen? He got shut down. Now, that may have caused some consternation between the Eisenhowers and the owner of the hotel. When he and his family decided they were going to shut down the hotel in the 1960s, if you can believe it, it was still open, he invited Mamie and Ike to be served the Last Supper at the hotel before it shut down. So obviously, Ike must have made amends to the family. What a great story. Also here in Gettysburg, and this was something that I had no idea for many years existed, there is the Eisenhower tree. In 1954, during a reunion of the Camp Colt guys, they decided they were going to plant their captain's favorite tree in honor of their captain. White Scotch pine, supposedly. I don't know trees. But one of the very cool things that they did is they asked for all 48 states to send in a pound of dirt that they could then plant with that tree. They also asked the 2 territories, Hawaii and Alaska, to send in a pound of dirt that they could pass in with that they could put in with the tree. Now, all the states and the 2 territories complied with the request. How cool is that? Some of them did what you would expect. If Eisenhower served in their state, they dug up a pound of dirt from the fort that he was at and they sent that in. But there were 3 of them in particular that were very creative with their pound of dirt. For example, Texas sent in a pound of dirt from the Alamo. Kind of neat. Massachusetts, Patton's son was living in Massachusetts at the time, and he remembered the friendship between his father and Patton. So he sent in a pound of dirt from his backyard, honoring the Patton-Eisenhower relationship. But my favorite one was from Colorado, Eisenhower's mother-in-law's backyard. I hope he liked his mother-in-law. Now, just across the street from Gettysburg College was the Eisenhower's first rental apartment that they had when they were stationed out here, and that place is still there today. You can go see it. There is a plaque out front, but it's privately owned, so it's not something that you can go inside. But it's interesting, I find it very interesting that it's right across the street from Gettysburg College, because post-presidency, when the Eisenhowers moved out here to their farm and became permanent residents of Gettysburg, Dwight became part of the board of directors at Gettysburg College, and he actually wrote his memoirs while he was there. He had an office in the building that still is there today, and it's in the admissions building. So any of the students that come in, they get to sit in the Eisenhower office. I've been in it. It's quite awesome. This was one of 3 apartments that they would have. The second apartment was right next door to this one. And then the third one was up on Seminary Ridge. So our next link between the Civil War and World War II comes kind of in the middle. In 1938, it was decided to have a reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans. This would have been the 75th anniversary of the surviving Civil War veterans. The youngest of the 1900 Civil War veterans that came, now believe it or not, there were still about 10,687 surviving Civil War veterans. The 2017 census of Gettysburg was about 7,600 people. So there are more surviving Civil War veterans in 1938 than we have in the entire town of Gettysburg. They were expecting 250,000 people to show. About 100,000 of them got caught in the traffic circle in the center of town. They're probably still circling the center of town, trying to get out. Now, who do you think sent the most veterans to that 75th anniversary? You would think it'd be more East Coast based, wouldn't you? 150 was the biggest group of veterans, and they came from California. Can you imagine? 130 came from Texas. Pennsylvania was third with 115, which I was shocked. I would have thought we would have been in the kind of the number 1 spot there. And Ohio was the 4th at 106. Fascinating. Now, the youngest attendee at this reunion, 86 years old. That was the youngest. The oldest Civil War veteran that attended, 112. Where are my 112-year-olds in the audience? No one? No one? What do you think the biggest concern was by the people who were putting on this event? Death. I mean, it's July, right? Took place on July the 3rd. These guys are wearing wool suits, wool hats, wool vets, because that's what you dressed as at the time. So, what did they do? Well, first of all, they built a tent camp. These guys didn't want to stay in hotels. They wanted to be out in tents. At 112, I don't think I'd want to be in a tent. But the second thing that they did was they brought in the Boy Scouts, ever prepared. They gave these poor kids 2 rules. Rule number 1, do not let them die. Rule number 2, while they're here, if they want to do anything, you let them do it. But remember rule number 1. And there's a wonderful story that I happened to come across on YouTube dealing with the Boy Scouts. There was a tour that was being done by one of our battlefield guides. And this gentleman put his story on YouTube. There was an elderly gentleman who was a part of their group, and they went out to visit the Peace Light. After the battlefield guide finished giving the statistics of the Peace Light, he asked if there were any questions, and this elderly gentleman said, well, I'd like to share a story if I could. And they said, sure. He said, I was one of the Boy Scouts. I was assigned a Confederate soldier. And while we were there, this Confederate soldier wanted to go out and walk Pickett's charge. The kid was freaking. He really didn't want to do that. But he remembered rule number. So he took them out. He took this gentleman out to Pickett's charge, and they started walking across the field. They got halfway across the field. The elderly gentleman stopped. He closed his eyes, and he put down his head. What do you think the Boy Scout did? He was worried about rule number 1, you betcha. Yes, absolutely. So he let him go for a little while, and then he reached out and very gently touched him on the arm, and he said, sir, are you okay? The gentleman raised his head, he opened his eyes, and he said, this is as far as I got. We can go back now. Wonderful story. So the president was invited to come out and give this dedication for the Peace Light. There was one Confederate and one Union soldier that they had pull the ropes. FDR gave a very moving speech. But the thing with this picture, and this is the reason why we have this here, check out the Secret Service guys' outfits. Did they look like the Goon Squad? Look at their shoes. FDR gave a very moving speech about how staying out of war that we keep the peace. Because he knew, despite the fact that Churchill was operating behind the scenes and trying to convince FDR that they needed United States help with the war effort, he knew that Americans just didn't have the stomach for another war. We were still recovering from World War I. People didn't want to get back into another war. And I found it interesting, he talked about by us staying out of war, how we have peace. And yet, just 3 short years later, we're back into World War II. So, associated with the Peace Light, it's March 1963. A then President Kennedy comes out to Gettysburg for a personal tour. A gentleman by the name of Colonel Sheeds that you see in the car here with them and him and Jackie did the tour. So Colonel Sheeds was one of our licensed battlefield guides. He was also a history teacher at the high school here, the local high school here. A lot of my locals remember Colonel Sheeds very fondly. But he must have been a darn good guide because he got most of the important people to do the tours. Every president since 1938 has been offered to come out on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July to rededicate the Peace Light. So, Colonel Sheeds asked the president if he would be coming out. The president said, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to be in Europe at the time. I'll take a rain check. Colonel Sheeds said, well, in November we have this thing called Remembrance Day. And we read the Gettysburg Address. It's the dedication of the National Cemetery, the first national cemetery in the country. We did beat out Arlington by a year. Maybe you can come back and read the Gettysburg Address. What did President Kennedy say? I'm sorry, I can't make it. I'm going to Texas. I've got to go down and mend fences. Now I have to wonder, what would have happened, how history would have been different if he'd have come and read the Gettysburg Address instead of going to Texas. While they were here, Colonel Sheets took them out to the Peace Light. Now, at that time, he had told President Kennedy, other than, very few times, the light is continuously lit. The president was totally blown away by this concept. And I used to say, other than the 70s during the gas crisis, when I was giving my World War II tours, the light has remained permanently lit. But this summer, with all the rain, yeah, we were down for a couple of weeks this year. So besides the 70 gas crisis and the 2018 rains of Gettysburg, the Peace Light has remained continuously lit. The president was totally in awe. How does it work? He asked Colonel Sheets. How does the gas get up there? How does it all play out? And Colonel Sheets was very patient and explained everything to him, and he just loved it. As a matter of fact, in Jackie's memoirs, she writes that for the next 3 months, anybody who came to the White House got the full rundown on the Gettysburg Peace Light. Now, how many of you have been out to the Kennedy gravesite in Arlington? A lot of you. What does he have on his gravesite? An eternal flame. Jackie remembered how much he loved the Gettysburg Peace Light eternal flame and had one put on his gravesite in his memory. How neat is that? All because of Gettysburg. So it's the 1930s. What's going on? Depression. So how did the president put young men and boys back to work? Civilian Conservation Corps camps, CCC camps. We had 2 of them here, located just across the street from Pickett's Charge. One of those is in a location today called McMillan Woods. And this is a photograph of it. Today, it's a Boy Scout camp. So for those of you who know where the Boy Scout camp is, now you know where the CCC camp was. The other one was down in Pfizer Woods, which is just down the road a piece, because of course, one was an all African American unit, and the other one was an all-white unit. Racism being what it was at that time, you could not have the 2 meeting. The one in McMillan Woods was the all-black unit. So there were some permanent structures located down in the woods there that the guys who worked in the CCC camp used. They did things like cleaned brush, they beautified the area, they set up things for the Peace Light dedication in 1938, and they continued even post for a little while after. They reset all the headstones in the cemetery that were there at the time. But in the 1940s, after we got into World War II, the military took those structures over down in McMillan Woods, and they put in a mobile radio broadcasting unit. And this mobile radio broadcasting unit came up from Virginia. It was put together with a bunch of guys that you wouldn't normally expect to see in the military. These were guys who were musicians. They were screenwriters for Disney. They were artists. And a lot of them had German language capability. So what they were up here doing is they were up here learning how to create psychological warfare. They were going to do 2 things. They were going to, number 1, drop leaflets from bombers down on German troops, trying to convince them to surrender. And number 2, they were going to go in and do the mobile radio broadcasts on the backs of Jeeps and things, trying to convince those same troops to surrender. So they were going to attack it from 2 different ways. Now, this was a best-kept secret, what was going on in McMillan Woods, until one night. One of the guys was practicing his German, and he flipped on the radio, and he tuned to what he thought was a good channel, and he sent out a broadcast that basically said, Achtung, Achtung, surrender, we're coming for you. Now, back in the 1930s, what did civilians do for fun? They listened to the radio. So how would you feel if you're sitting at home at night, you're a local Gettysburg person, and all of a sudden in German you hear, Achtung, surrender, we're coming for you. The town totally freaked out. They called the police, they called the military, they called the FBI, they called everybody they knew to call to come and rescue them from the Germans that were coming to invade. Then it wasn't a best kept secret anymore. This is what Camp Sharp looks like today. It was renamed Camp Sharp after General Meade's intelligence officer. Since this was a psychological warfare camp, they decided to honor General Meade's intelligence officer by the name of Sharp. But today, as I said, it is a Boy Scout camp. Now, see the flagpole in the background? That is the only scar left from that psychological warfare camp. Now, the lady that you see holding the picture there, her name is Beverly Eddy. And if you are interested in learning more about the Camp Sharp psychological warfare camp, she wrote an excellent book. It is outstanding. Reads like an adventure novel, very easy read. You can get through it in about a day. But I wholeheartedly encourage you all to check that out. Very, very interesting. Just across the street from McPherson's Woods, and here again on Pickett's charge, a young man, a young captain again, by the name of Lawrence Thomas, was brought in from Oklahoma to open up a POW camp here at the same site that Camp Colt was at. Now, this was brand new. It had not been done before. At the time, there were base camps for POWs, and there were interrogation camps for POWs. That was it. This was called a branch camp, and here again, it was supposed to be a temporary camp. Under Geneva Convention, the U.S. military asked the combatants' militaries, because they had to notify them once POWs started coming into the United States. At its high point in 1945, we had over 425,000 POWs here in the States. What do you do with all of them? So the military came up with the idea of, hey, all the men and guys are at war. Let's put them to work, especially here in Gettysburg. We got a lot of farmers who can't get their crops in. We got a lot of canneries who can't get the job done, tanneries. And so they set up, they had a bunch of orchards that they put out these POWs. And a lot of locals remember coming here as children and seeing the POWs. Captain Thomas said, well, you know what, we got to pay you, we got to treat you humanely, so we're going to give you $1 a day to work, either picking fruit. For POWs, their first introduction came in early June. They went and picked peas and beans. They didn't like it. But towards the end of June, the cherries came in. They liked picking cherries. And by November of that year, we had a bumper apple crop that came in. And both the POWs and the guards liked picking the apples. They'd shove them in their pockets. And for that, they were supposed to get $1 a day. Now, Captain Thomas said, well, wait a minute. We got to house you. We got to feed you. We got to clothe you. So we're going to take 90 cents of that back. We'll give you a dime a day. But you know what? We're not even going to do that. We're going to give you a paper chit that says you earn 10 cents, and if you save up all your chits, there's a tent out on the POW camp that sells things like stamps and writing paper and things to that effect. Cigarettes for those that smoked. You can go out there and save up your chits and go to the tent. By doing this, Captain Thomas made $138,000 for the U.S. military. That was very well received. And on top of that, all those cherries and apples and beans that the POWs picked, did they go to the farmers? It went to the military in support of the war effort. And the farmers were happy to do it. They did have a local doctor who would come out, make sure that they took care of the guys. Now, once the Psycho Boys, let me go back a little bit. Once the Psycho Boys left, they left after D-Day occurred, so they could go into Europe and begin their psychological warfare. And by this time, you're getting towards fall. So what did those POWs do? Well, half of them went back to a base camp at Indiantown Gap, permanent camp. The other half got sent across the street to the more permanent structures to stay out of the cold, and they continued to clear brush and do things like that until January. And the camp officially closed in January 45. Something else that most folks don't know is here in Gettysburg there was a hotel here called the Lee Mead Inn, and that Lee Mead Inn was just between Big and Little Round Top. You all, I'm sure, went up to Little Round Top today, did you not? This was a nice hotel. Not only did it have a hotel facility with its own restaurant, but it also had 18 cottages. So if you wanted to bring your families up here, you could do that. Temple University came up, and they rented out the entire Lee Mead Inn. They rented it out because they had some U.S. Army Air Corps pilot trainees that they needed to train taking off and landing. Philadelphia was under a no-fly zone. So how do they train if they can't take off and land? Well, you saw the area out there, lots of big fields. And again, I'm sure the Park Service was very amused with this, but they had planes taking off and landing out there in the battlefield areas. But very quietly, Temple University moved out. You know, townspeople got very used to seeing people, taking off and landing these aircraft. Planes continued to take off and land even after they moved out, so the locals didn't know anything was afoot. But the U.S. military took it over, and they fired everybody at the hotel except for 3 people. Now, who would you like to keep at the hotel? The cook. They kept 1 cook. Who else? 2 cleaning crew. Yeah. So they kept 1 cook, 2 cleaning crew. Everybody else got let go, and they moved in 47 Forest Servicery guys. Now, their job, those planes that were now taking off and landing, were bringing in spy photographs from the Pacific. They were tasked with creating topographical maps for the Pacific effort. One of the maps that came out of that effort was the Iwo Jima landing topical map. And it probably never would have been discovered had it not been for a gentleman who was doing some information searching on Admiral Nimitz. And he found a letter from Admiral Nimitz congratulating the guys at Gettysburg for their outstanding maps. Who knew? There were a couple of articles that came out about it, but it just got covered up very quickly. Now, just down the road a piece here, there's a place called Michaud Forest. Michaud Forest, Captain Thomas, he left here in October, and Captain Copley took over the POW camp here in Gettysburg. He moved down to Michaud Forest and opened up an interrogation camp because we had 2 interrogation camps prior to this. One was on the West Coast for any of the Japanese POWs that came in. And throughout the World War II, we had 3,915 Japanese POWs. Why so few? They fought to the death. That was their culture, right? You didn't become a prisoner of war. We had approximately 400,000 Germans and Italians. So a lot more. So the interrogation camp in Virginia got overwhelmed. Unlike here in Gettysburg, where the scars have healed, the scars still remain out there. And I know you can't see it very well in this picture, but one of the prisoners etched his information on one of the bridges there, still there today. These are all prisoners that etched their names into different things that they had to do while they were at that interrogation camp. And Captain Thomas was the only commander of that camp until it closed. A second wonderful publication I'll recommend to you is this one. And the Cumberland Valley Historical Society sells this one, all about Pine Grove Furnace. Again, very easy read. So, what did civilians do besides scrap drives? Victory gardens. What else? Yeah, a lot of rationing, didn't we? We had gas rationing. We did food stamps, sugar. This is what civilians did. Well, the National Park Service was required to do their bit as well. The superintendent at the time, because remember, now the Park Service has control, they were asked, what are you going to do? This was in October of 1942. What are you going to do to support the war effort? The superintendent came up with 18 tons of scrap metal. In December, they came up again and said, what are you going to do to support the war effort? He came up with another 38 tons. Now, these were things that he felt that Gettysburg could do without. These were ceremonial cannonballs, not real cannonballs. These were some street signs. These were some broken down trucks, all things that he felt that they could do without. But then they came again, and they said, what about the monuments? You need to come up with a list of monuments that'll be melted down in what order? And that's what he did. 8 different tiers. This was the final tier. This would be after all the monuments that you saw today were melted down. And I find it interesting that all 3 were Confederate. Did you see that one today? The Virginia Memorial? Wouldn't be a tour without it, would it? This one's the Alabama Memorial and the North Carolina Memorial. You probably passed by both of these as well. The reason why these 3 were the last ones was because they felt the artistic measure was too high to be without. For many years, Confederate monuments were allowed. So I find it interesting that the last 3 were all Confederate. How many of you have heard of this guy? Yeah, kind of a prickly character, wasn't he? He came here to visit. Eisenhower took him on a tour, and Monty decided to tell Eisenhower, and as well as all the news media that trailed along behind them, how he would have won the war. It would have been much shorter, and that if they had just done what he wanted to do, it would have been just fine. Now, Eisenhower listened very carefully, very nicely, very politely, and at the end, his response to Monty was, Monty, I have to live here. Ike had invited him to stay out at the farm. Now, his memoirs had just come out. Mamie was not happy with the fact that he said that Ike was an inexperienced leader and should have never been named Supreme Commander. This is well after the war. So she didn't let him sleep in the house. These were the Secret Service quarters. That's where Monty stayed. Khrushchev came out here in 1959. Talks between the United States. You know, the Sovs were an ally during World War II, weren't they? But in 1959, were they an ally? Talks were very tense. A then President Eisenhower said, let's have a good old-fashioned barbecue out at the farm. He served corn on the cob. The Soviets used corn for animal feed. He had never had corn on the cob before. After his visit to Gettysburg, he went back to Moscow and commanded that corn would be grown for corn on the cob. And if you look online, you'll find a ton of pictures of him holding ears of corn because he loved corn on the cob. Winston Churchill came out here several times, loved walking the battlefield. His last visit out here, he was in a wheelchair, and he was crestfallen that he was not going to be able to walk his beloved battlefield. So what did he do? Eisenhower, this is how much respect he had for this man, chartered a helicopter. It landed on the farm. They loaded Eisenhower and Churchill into this little golf cart that you see here, took them out to the helicopter, and they toured the battlefield by helicopter. Churchill would die just a few years later. This would be his last visit to Gettysburg. There's a wonderful story that is a declassified Secret Service report during one of Churchill's visits out here. Ike was very proud of his cattle. On one of his visits, Ike took Churchill out to the barn, and Churchill decided he was going to slap the rump of every cattle. The Secret Service was mortified. They thought he was going to get gored. They thought he was going to get trampled. And they wrote up an incident report, which got classified. Fortunately for us, I can share this with you because it has now been declassified. And our last big visitor, Charles de Gaulle. Now, between Monty and between Charles de Gaulle, who was the biggest pain in the neck to Eisenhower? Hard to say. I think they both were a hard sell. De Gaulle was a Lee fan. He thought Robert E. Lee was the bee's knees. And here again, Eisenhower had to be very diplomatic. The last section I'm going to cover with you today is the National Cemetery, and I've got 3 heroes that I want to touch on just a little bit to finish up our talk here today. The National Cemetery has sections from, it started out as a Union cemetery. They decided to increase it, and so we have Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Now, technically, the cemetery is closed to new burials, although there are still burials that go on. Individuals who had their plots pre-picked as they pass on are being interred. However, no new people can get plots in the cemetery. For World War II, there are 6,000, out of the 6,917 grave sites, 1,624 of them, or roughly 23%, are World War II. And the biggest section is in Section 2 of the cemetery. A gentleman by the name of Ralph Siegel, one of our licensed battlefield guides, has worked very hard to put together some of their stories. And I want to finish up with just 3 of those individuals. One of those was Stephen Stembrowski. He was on board the USS Nevada. And if you can see his headstone, when did he die? On Pearl Harbor. Now, the USS Nevada was the only battleship during Pearl Harbor that had a full head of steam. And her captain, when the Japanese came in the first wave, decided he was going to try to get out of the harbor and take the ship to safety. The Japanese realized what was happening, and they figured if they could sink her, she'd block the harbor, and they'd be sitting ducks. When the captain realized that the Japanese had turned their attack to him, he intentionally beached the Nevada. They were sitting ducks. When the second wave came in, this is where most of the killed in actions, including Stembrowski, occurred. Our second one was Lewis Flanagan, and this gentleman touches my heart tremendously because he was a combat medic embedded in with a unit that came under sniper fire. The first guy got hit by the sniper and went down. because we leave no man behind. A second individual went out to try to rescue him and get him off the field. He was shot by the sniper. Third guy went out and also got hit by the sniper. Flanagan went out, crawled out into the field under sniper fire, rescued all 3 men and brought them back to safety. And for that, he was awarded a Bronze Star. He was killed just a short time later on Christmas Day in the Battle of the Bulge. And documentation from survivors said that while he was laying on the battlefield dying, he was comforting other men wounded around him, telling them it was going to be okay. What we have here may be the only 2 brothers that are buried side by side. One was killed in Belgium, one was killed in France. Frank was the older brother, but he was the lower rank. His brother Edward was a waist gunner, and all people on board aircraft got spot promotions because if the aircraft were shot down, they figured they'd get treated better in a POW camp if they were officers. So he got a spot promotion. But Frank was part of the 101st. Now, most of you remember the iconic picture of Eisenhower going out and talking to the 101st before they jumped for D-Day. The guys are all standing around him. They've got the black face on, and they're getting ready to go. They've got their parachutes. They say that Eisenhower cried on his way out because the statistics that he had gotten from his generals was that the 101st, both British and American, were going to lose 98%. They were targets. The good news is they didn't. They lost 25%, so much better. Frank survived the jump. He survived the D-Day landings and was killed 6 days later. So one buried in Belgium, one buried in France. The family chose, after the war was over, the War Department offered to bring the boys home. Some families chose to leave their loved ones overseas. Others chose to bring them home. They're here at Gettysburg Cemetery. And our last gentleman. Now look at his birth and his death. Do I have any mathematicians in here? (1927 to 1942). He was 15 years old. He was a Marine, Simplify. I did a little research into him. He had a very troubled youth, ran away from home 3 times, and then hooked up with the Marines and turned his life completely around. My first question is, how did he get into the Marines at age 15? He was from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Must have been one of those big coal miner guys. He landed with the troops in Guadalcanal. Now, for those of you that don't know the story of Guadalcanal, when the Marines landed, Japanese warships came into the area and chased their supply ships away, leaving the Marines stranded. For 2 months, from the time that they landed until the time this gentleman was killed, he survived on rice and rats at age 15. I worked for the government for 37 years in the intelligence world. I had this hanging over, I made this little PowerPoint thing, had it hanging over my desk every day. Because you all were the people that I supported. And if I did my job right, you'd come home. And I felt that every day. And it was an honor. What have you done for him lately? So in closing, let me say to all of you, it was an honor to share this day with you. We hope to see you back. We'd love to take you on a World War II tour. If you have any questions, I'll stay here until the next speaker comes. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your day here. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service.
Tara, thank you so much for that just incredible presentation. And she, as many others today, donated her time for you veterans and guests. We're going to give everybody a brief 10-minute bathroom break, and then we're going to get back into the second part of our program. And then we're going to be loading to head back home. I did want to mention we're going to be calling the buses by bus and the way we came, but the Hanover buses will be departing first. So the Hanover group will pull your buses up, so at the very end we'll be dismissing you. But if you need to use the restroom, we're going to give you a 10-minute break.
If I could have your attention, please. At ease. I knew that E6 would pay off someday, you know. If you could have your seats, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and we'll finish up this afternoon. I just, a couple things I want to pass along with you. First of all, I owe you an apology. I understand some of you didn't get dessert this afternoon, and I apologize for that, and blame me. We had a local organization donate 1,000 cookies for the 400 of you. I said that was enough. It wasn't enough. So I actually want to thank the hotel because they cleaned out their pastry kitchen. The pies and cakes, they weren't planning on serving any of that, so I'm not sure who's having what for dinner tonight, but. I made some notes as the day went on that I had a prepared text, but I just made notes during the day, some things that I guess you can do this when you're old, right? In our previous speech, they talked about General Omar Bradley, the last 5-star general. And when I was hearing that, I started chuckling to myself and remembering back, and I think it was 1964. I was 11 years old. I met General Bradley. And I lived in the small town of Moberly, Missouri. I grew up there, I was born there. Moberly, Missouri claims the birthplace of Omar Bradley. He was there to dedicate the airport his name for the second time. He originally had dedicated it back in the 40s sometime, and he actually couldn't have been there because of the war, but it was dedicated. But in 1964, he came back and dedicated the airport. And I remember he was the chairman of the board of the Boulevard Watch Company at the time. But I remember my mom and dad taking me and my sister there to see General Bradley and how cool that was. And that was a long time ago. So anyway. So now you know I'm from Moberly, Missouri. The other thing I want to pass along, and it kind of follows with what John was talking about. While he was talking about his parents, I started thinking about my family in the military. My grandfather was in the Rainbow Division in World War I, served in France, was wounded. I realized about 5 years ago why I hated France. It was all my grandfather's fault. He had told me all those years growing up how the damn French almost got him killed. But my wife wanted to go there, so we went to France. We had a great time, by the way, and we're going to go back someday. But I realized after all these years, my grandfather was the one that told me how bad France was. So then later on, and this is going to start off with a little sad story, but I promise you it's going to end up with a laugh. So my mother was married to a gentleman prior to World War II, and he got drafted, Gordon Lee Lindsay. He served in the 11th Company L, the 110th Infantry, the 28th Division. I didn't know at the time, but that the 28th Division is Pennsylvania. And I know many of you probably know that. I didn't know that until just a couple of years ago. Gordon was killed in Germany in 1944. And what I was remembering today when we were talking about this was, wow, war's bad for everybody. Nobody wins. But my mother was home at my aunt's house at the time by herself when a taxi cab showed up and delivered a telegram. And how terrible that had to be. 9 years later, I was born. My mother had met my dad, who served in World War II. He's a staff sergeant in the engineers. I was born, and I have the middle name Lee, from Gordon Lee Lindsay. Very proud of that. Anyway, the story gets better, okay? So in 1972, I missed the draft numbers, and I know my mother was really worried about that. And, you know, only son going to be drafted, and Vietnam was still going on. And she was really happy when my numbers were, I don't remember what they were, but my mom was real happy until about 30 days later when I came home and told her I'd enlisted in the Army National Guard. She was not a happy camper. And you didn't tick off my mom, even though she was 98 pounds. I never tackled her. I mean, you know, I'd go after my dad before I went after my mom. So mom was not a happy camper. But years later, after 6 years in the National Guard in Missouri and Arkansas, staff sergeant, I think she was pretty proud of me. But here's where the story really gets funny. So all these years ago, and you guys know, back in the Vietnam era, we had khakis. Remember the khakis? So I kept a set of those, you know, with my E6 and my name and the badges and all this stuff on it, thinking that someday my grandsons would want to play with those, or I would show them to him, you know? So about 5 or 6 years ago, my one grandson, who's now, I think, well, he's 15, so he was probably 10 or 9 at the time, something like that, was at my house, and he found in the closet this uniform. And he goes, "Grandpa, whose uniform is that?" And I said, "Well, that was mine." And I said, "You know, I kept it all these years thinking maybe someday you and your brother would want to play with it or something, show you." And he goes, "Grandpa, that's not your uniform." And I said, "Yeah, it is. It says flowers right here on the pocket." He goes, "Grandpa, you can't fit into that uniform." I still haven't figured out an answer for that, but the uniform's still hanging in the closet. But anyway, so I now have a 1-year-old grandson that maybe someday the story will change by then if I'm still alive. But anyway, the last thing I want to comment before I get to introduce somebody special is that, you know, Gettysburg is a wonderful place, and I've been here 13 years now, and I recall my first time driving through the square. It was actually a Saturday morning. I went down to get some coffee, and it was in October, and the sun, it was just a beautiful October morning, crisp, and the sky was blue, and the flag was flying in the square, and I got out of the car, and I'm old enough to remember, the first thing that popped in my mind was, this is a Norman Rockwell moment. And my comment at the time, and still 13 years later, is, I will stay here until I no longer have that moment. And every day I drive through the square, it's a Norman Rockwell moment. This is a beautiful place, and we thank you for coming. We thank you for what you've done. Please come back. There's so many wonderful things to do here, and some of them you've heard about today. But it's a beautiful place, and the history, the hallowed grounds here, but it's also a great place to bring your family for other things, and we're finding that, you know, our younger generation today is not being taught American history, and that is sad. That is really sad, and we have a job to do to try to preserve this and try to educate our younger people. And we're going to do our best at Destination Gettysburg to do that. But we're so proud of what you've done for America. And this next gentleman, a very special individual that was in Gettysburg a few years ago, well remembered. He's very special, and we had to do a lot of hard work to get him here today. But it's my privilege at this time to introduce to you the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. You know, as president, sometimes you don't feel much love coming your way. It's nice to feel the love, I can tell you that. Well, I am real pleased to be back in Gettysburg with you folks, you veterans and folks from the great state of Pennsylvania. Give yourselves a hand, I'll tell you that. Yeah. I have a warm spot in my heart for Pennsylvania. In fact, I have a great love of Pennsylvania for a variety of reasons, one of which is I have deep family roots in Pennsylvania. Now, my people who were Quakers came over to this country from England, and they settled up in Hingham, Massachusetts. Now, there's one thing about the Lincolns. Boy, they sure did move a lot. They moved maybe for the same reason some of you moved, for a new job or a better job, maybe more productive land. So some of the Lincolns come down into New Jersey, along the Toms River, and then my great-great-grandfather, Mordecai Lincoln. Anybody here named Mordecai? That's a great name, but you don't hear that very often. That's my great-great-grandfather's name, and he was an iron worker. So he left New Jersey and settled along the Schuylkill River. In fact, he settled right outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, in a little town called Birdsboro, where they were neighbors with the Boones. In fact, some of the Boones and Lincolns intermarried. Well, I tell you what, Mordecai built a home way back in 1730 that they tell me is still standing. And here's where my deep family roots get even better. He's buried in a Quaker graveyard with some of the Lincolns right outside of Birdsboro. Now, Mordecai, he had a son, John Lincoln, my great-grandfather. And here's where my roots get even deeper. He married a Lancaster County gal by the name of Rebecca Flowers. And they had a son, Abraham Lincoln, my grandfather, who I was named after. And he was born in Pennsylvania. So you can see why I say I have deep family roots in Pennsylvania. Now, my first visit to Pennsylvania was back in 1848 when I came to Philadelphia to attend the Whig presidential convention. The Whig, as my political party at the time, I was a Whig. And they did a good job at that convention. They nominated Zachary Scott, who became the 12th president, and Millard Fillmore, who became the 13th president. Now, I was not a delegate. I just came there to watch the proceedings. But more importantly, I wanted to come to Philadelphia to walk in the footsteps of our founding fathers. You see, I revered our founding fathers, especially for their plan to eliminate slavery. Oh, yes. Our founding fathers had a plan to eliminate slavery. You see, they were very familiar with slavery. They knew that the first Spanish colony, St. Augustine, had slaves. The first English colony, way back, 1619, Jamestown, Virginia, had slaves. So when they met in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, to form a new government, they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed in their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among those the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then our founding fathers said, now, if we can't settle the issue of slavery where it currently exists, we're going to do the next best thing. We're not going to let slavery grow. And if slavery can't grow, over time, the nutrients in the soil necessary to grow the cotton and the tobacco will diminish. Therefore, the size of the crops will diminish. Ergo, the need for slaves will diminish. And then slavery will die a natural death. That was the plan of our founding fathers. And those just weren't idle words. Oh, no. When we gained more lands as a result of Revolutionary War from the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the Continental Congress passed a Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And that Northwest Ordinance said all those lands that we acquired as a result of the Revolutionary War, slavery is prohibited in all those lands. So again, the question was settled. Slavery would die a natural death. And when they met again in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity, they spoke volumes by never mentioning the word slavery in the Constitution of the United States of America. And they went even further. They put a plan in effect for the gradual elimination of the international trade of such persons. So the question was settled. But then the issue of slavery kept festering, kept rising up, bubbling up. And when we gained more lands as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, we led to the first compromise, the famous Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820, where they drew a line 36 degrees, 30 minutes across the United States. And they said all lands north of that line that we've acquired as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, slavery is prohibited in all those lands. So again, the question was settled. But then, as you know, we gained more lands, and the question kept festering. And that led to another compromise, the Compromise of 1850, where again the question was settled. Until 1854, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said in effect, nope, sorry, Missouri Compromise null and void. Slavery can now extend into the new territories, reversing that policy of our founding fathers. Well, that put up a hue and cry across this country of ours and had tremendous political ramifications. For instance, my political party, the Whig Party, imploded over the issue of slavery. And in 1854, a brand new party arose out of the ashes, the Republican Party. And that Republican Party in 1854 was made up of anti-slavery Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, Free Soilers, anti-slavery American Party. And in 1856, they met, where did they meet? In Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, to hold the first Republican presidential convention. And they put as planks into the Republican platform all the plans of our founding fathers. And they nominated John Fremont to be the first Republican candidate for president. And they had a great slogan: free soil, free speech, free men, free Mont. It was a great slogan, but it didn't do John Fremont much good. James Buchanan was elected the 15th president. But here's where Pennsylvania come in. That Pennsylvania convention in 1856 was important for me personally, because on the first ballot, I received 110 votes for vice president. Of course, my friends told me the delegates quickly came to their senses and nominated Dayton of New Jersey on the second ballot. But nevertheless, that gave me my national exposure, so I found myself in 1860 in the second Republican convention held in Chicago as a candidate, as a favored son from Illinois. Now, here again, in the convention, you needed 233 votes to get the Republican nomination. Now, after the first ballot, William Seward of New York, the odds-on favorite, had 175. I had 101, and your own Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania had 54, and Chase of Ohio, Edward Bates of Missouri had 50 and 49 respectively. But here's where Pennsylvania came in. I could not have won the nomination for president without Pennsylvania, because on the second ballot, Simon Cameron put his delegates into my column, and that changed and got the momentum going, so I was elected unanimously on the third ballot. So Pennsylvania, I could not have been nominated. Now, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it had tremendous political ramifications for the Democratic Party. In that election of 1860, the Democratic Party split into three. If you were a Northern Democrat, you voted for Stephen A. Douglas. If you were a Southern Democrat, you voted for John Breckinridge. And if you were a Democrat, didn't like either of those gentlemen, you voted for John Bell. That's how in November of 1860, I was elected the 16th president with less than 40% of the popular vote. Now, just a quick historical review. In 1860, we had 31 million people living in the United States, 31 million. Of that 31 million, 4 million were slaves. 4 million slaves out of 31 million people. And we had 33 states in the Union. Of those 33 states, 15 were so-called slave states. Now, after I was elected, but before I was inaugurated, 7 of those 15 states said, we're sorry, we're not going to abide by the will of the majority. We're going to secede from the Union. And so South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Louisiana seceded from the Union. So I knew I needed help. And who better to get that help from those gentlemen that were vying for the Republican nomination with me? that team of rivals, so to speak. And that's what I did. I put him into my cabinet. William Seward, made him Secretary of State. Solomon Chase, Secretary of the Treasury. Edward Bates, Attorney General. The only problem I had is when I went to put Simon Cameron into my cabinet. And the pushback came from his own Pennsylvania delegation. They came to see me in Washington. They said, Mr. President, you don't want to put Simon Cameron in your cabinet. I said, well, why not? They said, well, Mr. President, do you know what Simon Cameron's definition is of an honest politician? I said, no, I don't. Said, well, Simon Cameron's definition of an honest politician is one who, once he's bought, stays bought. Well, I had to admit, that gave me pause. And I said, you don't mean to tell me that Simon Cameron would steal? And Thaddeus Stevens stood up, the great commoner from Lancaster, said, Mr. President, I do not believe that Simon Cameron would steal a red-hot stove. Well, that made me laugh, and I thought it was funny, and I told some of my other cabinet members, and then the next time I saw Thaddeus Stevens, I said, boy, that was really funny. He said, well, Mr. President, he said there was one man did not think it was funny, and that's Simon Cameron. And he's demanding a retraction. And Mr. President, that's what I'm here for. He said, I believe I told you I did not believe that Simon Cameron would steal a red-hot stove. I now retract that statement. Well, what came about actually was that the Pennsylvania delegations got together and patched up their differences, and I put Simon Cameron into my cabinet as Secretary of War. And then in about a year, I replaced him, made him Minister to Russia, and put a long-term Pittsburgh resident, Edwin Stanton, as Secretary of War. So you can see the importance of it. I could not have won it without that cabinet. And I can tell you another thing. We could not have brought the Civil War to a successful conclusion without Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania's support, for instance, political support at all levels of government. In the Senate, David Wilmot of Towanda, he of the eponymous Wilmot Proviso that said slavery could not go into any lands that we've gained as a result of the Mexican War. And he was a big help in the Senate. And in the House, that same Thaddeus Stevens I talked about had a key role. He was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, after we attempted to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, the insurgents opened fire, I called out for 75,000 troops for a period of 90 days to protect the country and keep Washington safe. I had one problem. I didn't have any money to pay them. Well, here's where Thaddeus Stevens came in record time. He introduced a bill on the floor, put it in a committee, got it out of committee, sent it up to the Senate, got it back from the Senate, back on the floor, voted, and we had money for those troops in record time, thanks to Pennsylvania and Thaddeus Stevens. And another time, I asked for $400,000, and on his own, he raised it to $500,000. Now, the only disagreement that we had was he never thought I was moving fast enough on the issue of slavery. Of course, after I signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he sort of changed his mind about that. But he did an excellent job. And in the local level, your governor, your great governor, Andrew Gregg Curtin, he had foremost foresight, he had training, he had resolve. And I'll tell you what, when I called for those troops, it was a very tense time in Washington. We were, in effect, surrounded. And the first troops to enter Washington, where do you think they came from? Pennsylvania, the first defenders. And they produced my first Civil War smile, because I knew then the Confederates could knock, but they weren't getting in, thanks to Governor Curtin. And it was also Governor Curtin that established a training facility in Harrisburg. It was later named after him, Camp Curtin. It was the largest training facility in the North. fact, it was the largest training facility north or south. By the end of the war, some 300,000 soldiers had passed through Camp Curtin. And it was Governor Curtin that made sure that Harrisburg was the railroad center. All of the ammunition, all of the supplies came out of Harrisburg on railroad cars to the Eastern Front, or out of Harrisburg on railroad cars over to Altoona, Pennsylvania, over the Allegheny Mountains to the Western Front. So it was that Governor Curtin. And it was Governor Curtin that purchased the battlefield lands after the Battle of Gettysburg and decided to have a cemetery for the Union fallen. And I'll tell you another thing he did not many people know about. In 1862, he called for the first Loyal Governors Conference. And they met in August in Altoona at the Logan Hotel. And they had two items on the agenda. How can we support President Lincoln in bringing the war to a successful conclusion? And how can we assist him in implementing the Emancipation Proclamation? And they came to Washington with those plans, and I tell you, I felt so good because I knew then that we could bring the war to a successful conclusion because I had the support of the people. Now, not many people knew about this because they didn't keep any minutes. But I can tell you, for me, that was very important for me, and that was Governor Curtin. And your own Pennsylvania towns, your citizens. Pennsylvania, under Great Curtin's leadership, produced over 360,000 soldiers for the Union cause, more than any other state except New York. And in Gettysburg, 34,530 participated. And they're remembered in the Pennsylvania Memorial, which is the biggest in the cemetery. And they showed their bravery. There were over 60 Medals of Honor awarded. Pennsylvania had 1/3 of them. So you see, Pennsylvania valor was demonstrated. And the towns, the people in the towns, poor Chambersburg was invaded 3 times by the Confederate forces in 62, 63, and 64. In 64, Jubal Early's troops demanded $500,000 in ransom, and they refused to pay. And they almost burnt Chambersburg to the ground. And a cry went up, "Remember Chambersburg." And York, northernmost town occupied by the Confederate forces. And Hanover, the key Battle of Hanover, where actually Jeb Stuart was defeated by McClintock and actually forced east so that he didn't arrive to Gettysburg to the night of the second day of the battle. So Lee didn't have his eyes and ears, all because of the Battle of Hanover. So you can see here again, Pennsylvania stepping up. It's no wonder I call Pennsylvania my personal keystone state. Now, my last visit to Pennsylvania, my wife Mary and I have never been to California. Was in 1864 in June, where we came to Philadelphia to attend what they call the Sanitary Commission Fair. Now, you may not know this, but for every soldier killed in battle, 2 died of disease, from dysentery, diarrhea, typhoid, malaria, most of it from the unsanitary conditions in the Army camps. So a group of civilians got together and they formed the Sanitary Commission. And their goal was to remove the sickness and death from due to the unsanitary conditions in the camp, provide humanitarian aid to the soldier to make sure he had cots and warm blankets. And it was the largest civilian endeavor in the war. It was the only one that was started by civilians, run by civilians, and funded by civilians. No tax dollars. Now, the way they got money was they would have these fairs throughout all the states, and they would raffle off and sell items. And here again, Pennsylvania stepped up. They raised over $1 million for the cause, more than any other city in the Union, Pennsylvania. So again, you can see Pennsylvania, my personal keystone state. Now, I talked about Governor Curtin's buying the battlefield land and having a cemetery, and he asked me to be there to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of the cemetery. And since we're here in Gettysburg, I suppose I would be remiss if in closing I did not share with you the remarks I made on the 19th of November, 1863, the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for all those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us rather to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is now my distinct honor to introduce to you Mr. Pete Lehigh with the Hanover Veterans Allied Honor Guard.
Thank you, Ken. All speakers start with a small story, and I guess I shouldn't break that mold. Had this old fella, and because of his age and the work he did and everything, he kind of looked pretty rough. And he's with his granddaughter one day. And they were talking, and she got a little quiet, and finally she said, "Grandpa, who made you?" He thought a minute. He said, "God." She said, "Well, who made me?" He said, "God." He said, "Grandpa, isn't he doing much better?" I want to thank John Bailey and his staff for this beautiful day and all the work that he's done. And we gave him a lot of those gray hair, I guess he has, but they're well earned. And you know, One other thing that we always forget is these young ladies that waited for us, or we were united with after we came home. So I think we should take 1 minute to thank those young ladies in attendance here today. Thank you. It's my honor to introduce the honor guard and to place this wreath. So at this time, would you please stand if you are able for the presentation of the colors. Sergeant of the Guard, present the colors. Present who? Order who? At this time, it's also my pleasure and honor, with the assistance of the Sergeant of the Guard, to present the wreath that we were going to present at the Peace Light in honor of all the services and all those that gave the supreme sacrifice. So please, attention, hot, present home. At this time, please remain presenting for the hats presented by Bugler from the Biglerville Honor Guard. Thank you. Right? Forward.
Gentlemen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. We're going to begin to call our buses, but first, I was told that when we introduced our World War II veterans, there was a young gentleman over here at this table that we missed that was a World War II veteran. Would you please stand? So, congratulations. Thank you. So I would like to call the first bus for the Hanover group. I guess, Bob, is that your bus? Bob Miller? So the first bus is dismissed, and we're going to call them one at a time because